This book talk in our series on reimagining the Latinx experience. We're very fortunate to have with us today Professor Ian Haney López from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where he is the Earl Warren Professor of Public Law, and he also co-founded the Race Class Narrative Project and co-chairs the AFL-CIO's Advisory Council on Racial and Economic Justice. What he's going to be doing today as part of our series is talking about some work that builds on his earlier work on Dogwhistle Politics. And the new book is Merge Left, and I've read it and really enjoyed it. It's an extremely insightful account of how, in his earlier work on Dogwhistle Politics, conservative politicians used racially coded messages to mobilize their base. And yet, progressives have been less able to figure out how to respond to that signaling. And so he actually embarked on long-term kind of empirical work to think about what kind of messaging is effective. And so in that sense, it's really, I think, exciting to see someone work so closely with organizations that do polling and so forth to figure out messaging. Now, before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of people who have been instrumental in making this happen. Robbie Kadri, Aaron Hebert, and Jillian Henry, who support all of our events and communications and our research centers here. And I also would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Isabella Ordorica, who has worked with me. She is a student here at UCI School of Law, and she does this while juggling other responsibilities, including working for a judge and serving as editor-in-chief of the UCI Law Review. And she is going to monitor the chat function. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat function, and Isabella will be reviewing that and posing questions to Professor López after he finishes his talk. Now with those, I also I should always mention the money people. I want to thank Dean Richardson and the UCI School of Law, as well as Ajay Mehrotra, who is director at the American Bar Foundation. Both of these organizations support this work. And now I'm going to turn it over to Professor López. I think you're in for a real treat.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm so glad to be able to join you. Actually, what I'm going to do today is go even, talk about research that's even more recent than Merge Left. So Merge Left is really thinking through like how to respond to Dogwhistle Politics, why the standard messages that Democrats try don't work. And it's based on research that was done in 2017 and 2018. But today I'm going to talk about research that was done just last summer. And this was research that was specifically aimed at figuring out how to talk to Latinos about politics, how to bring Latinos into a multiracial coalition, but understanding that the right's main strategy is to promote a sense of racial conflict and racial division. That implied that we also need messages that work for multiple racial communities simultaneously. So in doing this research, we did a survey of over 1,100 Latinos, but with especially large oversamples of whites and African Americans in addition. So 400 whites, 400 African Americans. And so I'm really going to talk about that research. And this is really going to be an opportunity for me to talk about the sort of this key factor for Latinos more than anything else. What drives Latino support for conservative politics, for Donald Trump, is their conception of Latino racial identity. And that's really a striking and important point. That's the sort of on the analytic side, and then on the prescriptive side, I'm going to urge a paradigm change in how we talk about race. That we move from talking about race in a white supremacy framework and start talking about racism as something that's weaponized by economic elites against all of us, in part by encouraging white supremacy. right? So there's a shift from, another way to think about it is a shift from white people in general are the problem to economic elites pushing division are the problem, and they win when they encourage whites to focus on, you know, whiteness and the threat to them from people of color and whatnot. Okay, so here's this research. This is the what I'm calling the opposition racial fear narrative, but this is essentially lifted from Republican talking points. I know most of you are busy multitasking. In fact, you've completely tuned me out as you read the message, which is great. So, in essence, what we've got here is a Dogwhistle Politics, the use of code. The code is designed to do two things simultaneously. It's designed to trigger deeply internalized racist fears. So, racist fears about China or illegal immigrants that are rooted in a vision of immigrants as brown, as pathologically criminal, as violent. So designed to trigger those fears, and yet simultaneously also designed to maintain plausible deniability by using language that on its surface does not directly invoke race, and that when challenged can be defended as race neutral. So over and over again, Donald Trump would talk about the China virus, the Wuhan virus, and people would say that that's racist. And he would say, you know, accusing me of racism is actually what's racist. I'm just trying to be geographically accurate, right? And this is clearly, you can see his presidency as one deeply concerned with accuracy in all things. But this is how dog whistling works. Simultaneously, strategically, intentionally, purposefully designed. Indeed, a lot of message testing goes on in order to try and figure out these frames. And it's not just on the part of political campaigns and campaign consultants. This is also what's happening on the right wing sort of propaganda machine. So from Fox to Breitbart, InfoWars, right? There's a huge propaganda machine, and then a lot of sort of dog whistle entrepreneurs whose career depends upon scaring the hell out of people by triggering racist beliefs, but doing so in language that allows them to deny that that's what they're doing. Okay, so this is the typical message. And I think that many of us who hear this message recognize right away the racist underpinnings of the message. And that leads us to think a couple of things. One, that nobody but self-avowed bigots would vote for this, right? That people would have to recognize themselves as committed to white dominance before they'd vote for this. That's one assumption. And the other assumption is people of color aren't going to fall for this, right? That people of color are going to be attuned to the way in which these are stories that demean them and will reject this out of hand. But this is the sort of result in terms of how convincing this message is. So what we did in terms of the polling is we played somebody reading that message, reading that racial fear message, and then people were doing a dial test, which is designed as closely as possible to measure people's unconscious reactions. And you have a dial that's sort of a temperature thermometer. Dial up above 50 if you feel warmly towards or agree with a message. Dial down if you feel coldly or negative toward a message, right? And this is the average dial for these different groups. So here's persuadable voters, all races. And by persuadable voters, that's about 3 out of 5. There's a progressive base that is actually still pretty warm towards this message. Let me make some distinctions. There's activists, people who work in politics professionally. Progressive activists absolutely hate this message. The progressive base are people who routinely vote progressive. They also feel warmly towards people of color, support government regulation, distrust economic elites. They too find this message convincing. There's a conservative base, don't like people of color, distrust government, think the rich are rich because they work harder and are more deserving than the rest of us. They love this message. This persuadable voter is people who toggle between or combine different elements of that thinking. Sympathetic to it. Whites, sympathetic to it. African Americans, same level of warmth to this message as whites. And Latinos, just slightly more receptive to this message. So for anybody thinking, hey, only bigots would be susceptible to this, not so at all. This is Dogwhistle Politics. It's working. It's triggering racist fears, but it's also coming across as common sense, as not about racism at all. And for those who think people of color aren't going to fall for this, not true. But let's dig a little bit deeper into who's reacting to this positively. So start here, Latinos are. So this is, I'm now breaking down the reaction among Latinos to this dog whistle racial fear message. And I'm going to make a distinction between Latinos who think that Latinos are people of color versus Latinos who think Latinos are white ethnics or instead bootstrappers. And I'll define those terms in just a bit. It's really fascinating sort of what these racial self-conceptions encompass. The main takeaway here is it's these folks who are reacting most positively to a conservative racial fear message. That's the main takeaway. Second takeaway, these numbers. We're trying to figure out how many Latinos see Latinos as a group as people of color. It's 1 in 4. And that's big news for those of us progressive Latinos, because almost all of us assume Latinos are people of color. Indeed, a lot of us have spent our time promoting the idea that we're people of color. I wrote an article saying we're people of color, not to see ourselves as people of color, right? And apparently 3/4 of Latinos have not read my article at a minimum, right? So it's like, we think this. The majority of the community don't. This is 32%. This is 28%. That leaves another 15% who don't know. And I guarantee you the don't know crowd is more likely to be over here than it is to say, I'm not sure, but I think we're people of color, right? So how people conceptualize their racial identity is making a really big difference in their susceptibility to dog whistling. Those of us who think we're people of color should recognize our views really only resonate with 1 out of 4 Latinos. Before I talk a little bit more about the sort of people of color versus white ethnics versus bootstrappers, the point I want to make here is there are these stories about what matters among Latinos. And one big story is the sort of Cuba story. Political differences among Latinos are really a factor of family's national origin. And, Cubans are more conservative. And that's slightly true. This is 62 versus 61. Puerto Ricans, interestingly, same, right? So there's a slight difference there. There's a slight difference here in terms of age. This is 60 versus 61. In terms of gender on these moment-to-moment reactions, there was actually no difference. I could have put up here region, Florida, Arizona, the upper Midwest, very slight differences. This is where the big difference is. It's people's conception of Latino racial identity that is most strongly correlated with divergent sympathy for a racial fear message, right? This is doing, I think, most of the work. So this all was done in July 2020. A lot of the research that's come out about the 2020 election has said a couple of interesting things. One, there was a story that emerged immediately after the 2020 election that this was gender, and in particular that Latino men had broken for Trump and that this was machismo. That's not true. Now that we have better data, it's clear that Trump made bigger gains among Latino women than among Latino men, and that these bigger gains were among Latino women under the age of 50. So this idea that it's gender that's driving this, machismo that's driving this, not true. Another story that has come out and that is sort of popular in the wake of 2020 is that this is sort of Cubans and Venezuelans in Florida. Not so. Data after 2020 showed that the shift towards Trump among Latinos was across the country and not regionally driven. Another story that has emerged is that shift towards Trump is primarily about economics. It's a little bit more complicated. On the one hand, we should be clear, the shift towards Trump was among Latinos who kept their jobs more than among Latinos who lost their jobs. So you wouldn't want a story of economics that emphasized economic hardship. Those who are in relatively better economic positions were more likely to shift towards Trump than those who had lost their jobs in the pandemic. On the other hand, it's important from a Dogwhistle perspective to recognize the right uses the language of economics as cover for good people and bad people. Good people work hard and do well. Bad people are lazy and are welfare cheats. That code is also racialized. So even the language of economics, to the extent that people invoke economics in explaining their vote preferences, the language of economics is not separable from a language of dog whistling. Okay, moving on. This should be pretty interesting to folks. What is, what is this this difference between in terms of racial self-conception that I'm talking about? Let me be clear. In my survey, I asked a series of questions about race. One question is, what race do you think you are? And there was sort of a, an explosion of answers, no surprise. Another question I asked is, if people don't know you, what race do they think you are, right? And this is so one is the internal. Another question is the external. If people don't know you, what race do they assume you are? This was another question entirely. I presented this to people as a forced choice. Latinos are like, and then Latinos are more like, and I said, a group that, like African Americans, remain distinct over generations, right? And this is my effort to capture the, we're really people of color. Yeah, 25%. Another choice, a group that, like European Americans, over generations become part of the mainstream. And this is the group that I'm calling white ethnics. And yet another group was not primarily as people of color, white ethnics, but as a group that over generations gets ahead through hard work. Right. And here my intuition was, frankly, I was thinking about some of my own family members say, coming to this country as immigrants, saying whatever is happening in this country in terms of race, it's not going to constrain our lives, or it's not going to constrain the lives of our children, right? And so then when you dig down a little bit deeper, the people of color group, younger, US born, progressive base, most likely to have a college education, these are our students, basically. It's a lot of us, they're our students. Here's an interesting point. This is not about skin color. This is not equal to skin color. Those Latinos who say Latinos are people of color are also the most likely to say they're perceived as being white or Caucasian. In contrast, those who say are bootstrappers, these are the ones who are the least likely to say that they're perceived as white or Caucasian. In other words, they're dark. So this is not about skin color. Another thing this is not about disaffiliation. Levels of pride in being Latino, like how proud are you of your Latino heritage, and levels of felt connection to Latinos, how important is it to you to be a part of a Latino community? were equally high across all these groups, indeed, slightly higher among this group. So this isn't a story of some Latinos just want to be white and don't want to be Latino, and they're walking away and they're disaffiliating. They're passing for white, right? They're light skinned and they're out, they're passing for white. They're not admitting to anybody that they're Latino. I mean, there are some individuals who are doing that for sure, but that's not the larger dynamic that we're picking up here. People's sense of connection with the community and their pride of being Latino is equally high across all these groups. This is really a conversation about how they see the racial position and the racial future of Latinos as a whole. Older immigrants, bilingual, this is also the group most likely to have graduate degrees. So we can think of these as the sort of professional, highly skilled immigrants, along with believing that Latinos are becoming part of the mainstream, is holding negative views towards people of color. And that's not a surprise. If you, and that's part of when we talk about anti-Black racism in the Latino community, that's much more likely among those Latinos who say, hey, Latinos are becoming part of the mainstream. Because if you say we're becoming part of the mainstream, you also have to explain why so many people are trapped, so many people are marginalized. And the available story for that is racial inferiority. Something's wrong with those people. They're dangerous, they're lazy, they refuse to work. The Bootstrappers, let me give you a shorthand on who the Bootstrappers are. This is perhaps unfair or a little bit too reductive, but these are the folks that are slightly too dark to plausibly claim that Latinos are on the cusp of joining the mainstream as whites or as white ethnics. So, but at the same time, they don't want to say the lives of Latinos are constrained by racism. So they've adopted a racial position of saying race doesn't matter in this country. Hard work and character matters. And I really want to emphasize, insisting that race doesn't matter in the United States and that what matters is individual character and hard work is a racial position, right? It's talking about, it's establishing a claim about how race works in this country, even if the claim is racism isn't a constraint on our lives, right? And so these are the three folks. This is so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare three different sorts of messages to talk with these folks. I'm going to do this in comparison, setting as a baseline the racial fear message, right? So the question, so what this chart is doing is it's measuring, do these different messages, a call out racism message, a colorblind message, or what I'm going to propose as a race class message, do they beat a racial fear message? How do they compare to a racial fear message? Before I start that, let me explain these numbers here, which I just threw up. This is support for Biden. This is support for Trump. Among white ethnics and bootstrappers, 56 to 32. Among, and again, these are Latinos are, right? So among Latinos who say we're people of color, this is the progressive. These are progressives. This is most of us. I presume this is most of the people we know. These are most of our students. One thing to note here is this people of color cohort likes just about every progressive message, right? You wanna condemn white racism, we're there. You want to call for economic populism in a colorblind way without talking about racial division, support that too. You want to talk about cross-racial solidarity, great. Slight preference, but on the whole, we like all of these messages. In comparison, call out white racism, that's going to lose to the racial fear message. Among Latinos, and again, this is 60%. It's actually 60% plus. You want to condemn white racism as your basic strategy for mobilizing Latino support, it's going to lose to a racial fear message. The solution, and you're starting to see this from different commentators. One way to read this is, oh, Latinos don't think of themselves as people of color, therefore they're basically white, and we should stop talking about race. this is what it looks like when you don't talk about race, when you just talk about economics, right? And basically this ties the racial fear message. This is an important moment to say. Messaging, the story we tell, is an important part of the turnout and mobilization question, but also important is actual grassroots mobilization. That's the story of Arizona and Florida. Both of them saw heavy investments in grassroots mobilization, Democrats in Arizona, Republicans in Florida, and big payoffs for both groups. Another question is propaganda and misinformation. Misinformation was very high in terms of Latino communities, and part of the reason is because the big social media outfits had almost no capacity to control misinformation in Spanish. All of their tools for controlling misinformation were in English only. And then last, advertising. When is the spend, how much is spent and when is the spending? GOP was spending heavily on advertising to Latinos for a 2-year period. Ultimately, Democrats outspent Republican spending, but did so in the last 3 months. So there's a huge wave of spending, but in the last 3 months. So this is what a tie looks like. This is when all these other factors come in. To actually beat the racial fear message, only the race class approach actually beats the racial fear message. In this slide, all I really want to communicate is these Latino voters who think of Latinos as white ethnics or bootstrappers parallel persuadable voters for all racial groups. And this is white, black, brown. In my study, in this 2020 study, I've done previous work that includes the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and also Native Americans, and the results are pretty similar. I do think more work needs to be done, especially with AAPI communities, especially in the context of the sort of the pandemic and the emphasis on a China virus and the anti-Asian violence that has metastasized recently, and the growing political mobilization that's happening among Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. So past research has shown a similar dynamic among AAPI, but really we need to be doing research with that community. Key point here, to sort of call out racism loses, this sort of ignore race ties. If you want to win, it's really a race class story. So this is the call out racism message, just so you understand what I'm talking about. If you read that message, it should sound pretty familiar to you. This is frankly the way a lot of us in the legal academy talk about racism. Right? We say, we talk about xenophobia, systemic racism, hatred, and then we really focus on harms to communities of color. And implicitly in this story, white people aren't harmed by racism, and in fact are the problem. Right? And now, if that's how that's framed, well, okay, so you can see how among the sort of, Latinos who think Latinos are people of color, that works. But among the white ethnics and among the bootstrappers, it doesn't. The other thing I'd say here is this is July 2020. So this is the height of the sort of the Black Lives Matter protests over the murder of George Floyd. This was the height of public support for those protests. In August, September, and October of 2020, public support for those protests plummeted. And it plummeted as it was politicized and attacked. These are the best numbers I've ever seen for a call out racism message. Typically, a call out racism message loses with every cohort that we've tested it with. Right? So here it's actually winning sometimes or tying. That's the best I've ever seen. I wouldn't expect it to do that well now. I really think this is an effect of July 2020. This is the colorblind message. This is just economic populism, effective response to COVID. And again, what you're seeing is, especially among the bootstrappers, ignoring race doesn't work. And that's not a surprise. What the right is doing is promoting a racial status conflict. It's saying there's good people in society and there's bad people. And it's no surprise that everybody's trying to locate themselves in terms of these status hierarchies. And especially what we found in our focus groups is people are trying to locate themselves in their, so the main status conflict is between whites and people of color. But now when you talk to communities of color, within communities of color, people are saying, Donald Trump, he's talking about illegals. He's not talking about me. He's not talking about my family. Or Donald Trump, he's talking about Mexicans. But I'm South American or I'm Cuban, right? There's a real effort to displace low status onto one's neighbors rather than to accept it as a description of oneself. And so when Democrats only talk about economic or issues or healthcare or the environment, but don't address status anxiety, the power of status anxiety remains. This is the division as strategy, reject racism. This is the sort of race class approach. I'll show you what this message looks like in a second. All I want to communicate here is, first and foremost, this is the winning message among persuadable voters, all races. Second, it wins among bootstrappers, it wins among white ethnics, right? And remember, white ethnics and bootstrappers look like a lot like persuadable voters, all races. If you want to call out, this is the racial fear message. If you want to call out racism, that's going to lose. If you want to ignore it, that will tie. Let me just say something else about a tie between a racial fear message and economic populism. In the context of structural advantages in terms of the Electoral College for Republicans, in the context of gerrymandering, in the context of accelerating vote disenfranchisement, Democrats can't afford a message that simply ties. Democrats need a message that is stronger, that is more compelling than a racial fear division message. What does that look like? This is what it looks like. We had come so far, but now COVID-19 threatens our families, for instance, with health risks, record unemployment, and losing the businesses we worked hard to build. To overcome those challenges, we need to pull together, no matter our race or ethnicity. We've done this before and can do it again. But instead of uniting us, certain politicians make divisions worse, insulting and blaming different groups. When they divide us, they can more easily rig our government and the economy for their wealthy campaign donors. When we come together by rejecting racism against anyone, we can elect new leaders who support proven solutions that work for all working families. What does this do? It centers race, not colorblind. This is huge because so many people want to move from calling out white racism it backfires, and it does. Therefore, let's not talk about race at all. That's a huge mistake. We need to talk about race. We just need to talk about it differently. So one, you need to talk about race. But two, racism as weapon, not as bad white people. This is the paradigm change. Talk about race, talk about racial division, but tell a different story in which it's a weapon of politicians who are doing the bidding of their wealthy campaign donors, because when they can divide and distract us, they can rig the rules of the government and the economy for themselves. And then end with cross-racial solidarity. And notice this is not an appeal to cross-racial solidarity as an abstract ideal. This isn't a United Colors, a Benetton, we are the world, we're all just holding hands and singing songs. People hate that message. This is a message that says we're being intentionally divided. We need to purposefully come together so that we have enough power to get the good things we need for all of our families. Often we end this to help all working families, white, black, and brown. We put race in that message to make it clear that the benefits of cross-racial solidarity accrue to every racial group. And notice the distinction between the sort of a typical message of the race left. The typical message of the race left is we need to promote racial equity to help communities of color. The moment you say that, many white people say, so this is zero sum and I'm going to lose, right? And I think this is precisely what happened in terms of the effort to repeal Prop 209 and reinstate affirmative action in California just this past term. It was framed as a program that was important for people of color and women. But if that's how you frame the program, rather than as a program that's important for all of us so that we can build power with each other and take care of our families, if you frame it as this is for people of color, you immediately communicate to whites this isn't for you. The other thing that I think people didn't recognize is that the proposition to restore affirmative action lost big among Latinos. And I kept telling folks, you think Latinos understand themselves as people of color who are in the same boat with African Americans, and that's how we think, but that's not how most in the community think. Certainly not how a lot of immigrants think. They think we're going to make it here, and we don't want handouts. We don't want to be seen as undeserving. We believe we're different, right? And they're thinking this through a racial lens for sure. This message, we are all in this together. Some people profit when they divide us. When we join together, we can take care of our families. This is a race-conscious message that builds power, not just, to come back to this. These are the bootstrappers who do not want to think of themselves as people of color. They love this message. These are the white ethnics who say we are not people of color. They love this message. Right? And this is the sort of persuadable voters, all races. This is a race-conscious message for building power across racial lines that convinces people no matter what racial identity they hold for themselves. In other words, you don't have to convince people that they're people of color before you can get people to buy into cross-racial solidarity that fights racism. You can convince people directly to believe in cross-racial solidarity and to fight racism when you describe racism as a weapon against all of us. If, on the other hand, you describe racism as white racism, white supremacy, white dominance, this is where you end up. You lose. I'm gonna finish up with this slide. This is something that I really want to emphasize. I'm really talking about racial justice here, and I wanna say it would be plausible. I mean, it would be understandable if you were listening to this talk and saying, okay, I get what Haney López is doing. He's trying to find a way to talk about racial justice in a way that's palatable to white folks. And on that level, I want to respond by saying, you bet. Yes, I am. Like this is a version of Derek Bell interest convergence, and Bell says racial justice happens when significant segments of the white population see that racial justice is in their interest. So yes, let's make clear to significant segments of the white population, racial justice is in their interest. But I also really want to emphasize this is a route to racial justice for communities of color. Indeed, this is how I got into this work in the first place. I first began to think about dog whistling when I was trying to understand mass incarceration and then mass deportation under the Obama administration. And when trying to think about mass incarceration and mass deportation, I mean, Obama built the machinery of mass deportation, built it to record levels that the United States had never seen before. Obama did. What I realized was that a story of racism that saw racism as simply in terms of white over non-white was insufficient to explain those dynamics. But that understanding racism as something that had been weaponized and made a part of American politics had more explanatory power, but then also had a different implication in terms of how we move forward. Because if you see racism as whites over non-whites, then I think you end up where Bell often ended up, with the pessimism that we could ever get past racism. But if you see racism as fundamentally a weapon against all of us that succeeds by promoting white over non-white conflict, that at least opens up the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that a coalition can be formed that includes whites, because whites will have their own pragmatic interest in defeating racism for their own sake, in addition to doing so because it's the moral thing to do. So this is my effort to try and show this with a couple of different sorts of issues. Immigration, and I've got one very similar on criminal justice reform. If you talk, so again, this is the racial fear baseline. This is the GOP message baseline. If you call out racism, including racism in the immigration system, this is a huge loss. Persuadable voters, all races, also loses, wins slightly among Latinos, a little bit better among African Americans. But again, remember, these are the best results I've ever seen for a call out racism message. This is, I'm going to show you in a second what a race class immigration message looks like. This actually doesn't look like anything when you're looking at it at a graph, but this is mind blowing. It really is. So again, the zero here is a racial fear message that whites have been bombarded with, in California, bombarded with since the 90s. Illegal immigrants are flooding the state coming in, right? This has been a national message that's just been pounded home since the 2000s nationally. And yet, when we test a message of immigration reform that stresses race as a weapon of division against all of us, we tied we tied the racial fear message among whites as a whole, not among persuadable whites or among whites as a whole. We can essentially tie a racial fear message the first time people have ever heard the message. And this is huge from a messaging point of view, because familiarity bias is powerful. People agree with things they've heard a lot. And now we test a message that people have never heard before, and it ties a message they've heard a lot: fear people of color, fear immigrants. We can tie it with a message of some politicians are trying to get ahead by turning us against immigrants. We need to reform our immigration policy. Okay. And then also, here's the other thing that I think is really significant. One of the big stumbling blocks to significant immigration reform is opposition to it from African Americans. African Americans have been pushed to see immigrants as their economic competitors. And in addition, if you think about like Claire Jean Kim and racial triangulation, there's a status hierarchy that puts Latinos and Asians above African Americans in terms of biology, but a status hierarchy that puts African Americans above Asian Americans and Latinos in terms of belonging. And it's been hard to get African Americans to dislodge this aspect of a status claim of we belong, who are these immigrants, they're line cutters, what are they doing, we're in competition. And yet, look how persuasive this is to African Americans. So this is really big, a message that wins broad support for immigration reform from African Americans. This is what that message looks like. And you'll recognize the basic form. We're all in this together. We're just trying to build a better life for our families. But Certain politicians are insulting immigrants while billions go to a handful of corporations. The richest 1% benefit when politicians blame immigrants. That is, and this is so important for the immigration justice folks. Stop arguing the facts about whether immigrants are dangerous or not. Stop trying to convince people that some immigrants are deserving and others are not. Shift to identifying all of the rhetoric about immigrants as dangerous as part of a big lie designed to divide and distract. Don't argue the lie. Get people to see that it is a lie, that it's a motivated lie as part of a strategy to divide and distract, and that when people fall for that lie, the real winners are the politicians and their dark money backers, right? It's a really important shift in terms of how we talk about immigration. And then, recognize contributions, embrace people with the courage to move, come together. We can elect new leaders who put fairness back, make this a country that provides a better life for everyone, whether we're brown, black, or white. Immigration reform is not just or even primarily about justice for immigrants. The minute you frame immigration reform that way, non-immigrants say, so I'm going to lose. So this is zero sum. You want me to do something for them. That's not my family. Those are, to use a phrase, other people's children. When in fact, when we switch it and say, when we reject the division that demonizes immigrants, that's when we can build a better life for our own family. Every racial group, every group benefits by humanizing our immigration system, by rejecting the demonization of immigrants. This is the message that works. And I want to go back. This is a message that builds the most support for immigration justice, and it's also more popular among African Americans and Latinos. So often racial justice folks say to me, I only care about two things. I care about helping my community, brown people or black people, and I care about talking to my community, brown people or black people. And my response is, okay, well, this cross-racial solidarity message that includes space for whites as part of a cross-racial approach is the best way to build broad political support for justice efforts for your community, and is the message that is most resonant with your community. This is criminal law, same effect. If we want big changes in a criminal law system, a race class approach is the only one that wins with whites, wins with persuadables, all races, is most persuasive among Latinos and African Americans. I'll just end with this. This is what it looks like. This is race conscious. It doesn't matter what race or ethnicity you are. We all know that growing up in a healthy neighborhood helps our children. Certain politicians describe some communities as basically criminal. Stoking fear seems like a strategy. Don't debate whether people of color are fundamentally criminal or not. Don't frame some people of color as deserving. Identify the idea that there's a problem with criminals and criminality in some communities as part of a big lie designed to divide and distract. And then when we reject messages of fear and division and join together, we can elect new leaders who ensure all our communities get better schools, not more barbed wire, and more jobs, not more jails. All our communities. Criminal justice reform, if framed as just for communities of color, creates the sense among whites that it's not for them, that they're losing, and that they're potentially exposing their families to violence. And why in the world should they take that risk? Traditionally, the left responds by saying because it's racist and immoral not to do otherwise. Not super compelling if people feel like they're losing and they're putting their children at risk. This answers by saying, take the risk, because that's the only way you'll build enough political power to stand up to the real threat in your life. And I'll stop there, which I have to, because I'm about to get cut off anyway.
No, thank you so much, Ian, for that fascinating presentation. And I'm going to turn it over now to Isabella to share with you questions that we got in the chat function.
Thank you so much. So our first question, I just wanted to say really interesting. Thank you. And she asks, I wonder what effect you predict from the current emphasis on environmental justice that is clearly an attempt at highlighting the particular harm of communities of color. How do we avoid turning off the white ethnic / bootstrapper Latinos?
Yeah, that's a great. So I'm actually working with groups like Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise, and they've actually been really open to this. Um, Again, you can see two approaches to averting climate collapse. One is to say, let's only talk about climate collapse. It's the issue. Why are we getting dragged into conversations about race? And then you can see the environmental justice approach that says, let's stress harms to communities of color. And those parallel what I've described as a colorblind approach or a sort of a call out white racism approach. And this race class approach is saying instead, try this message. The Koch brothers win by funding racial division. They funded the Tea Party. They're funding these efforts to promote racial division. And then when they win, they ensure control of government and regulate and then use that control to make sure that that government doesn't regulate their polluting industries. In order for us to have the political power necessary to stand up to major polluters, we need to build a cross-racial movement. In order to build a cross-racial movement, we need to reject division, make connections across racial lines, and work together to avert climate collapse, respond to inequities in environmental harms, and build a Green New Deal. Right. So it's exactly that sort of reframing that's important.
Thank you. Our next question is, what happens when organizations or politicians use multiple messages in a speech or on their website? For example, they might call out racism and present a race class message like you described. How do these messages interact with each other?
What's much more common is a let's do both approach to bad messaging. So Democrats know that ignoring race doesn't work. And in fact, it was Michael Dukakis who really showed them that ignoring race in the face of racial division didn't work. He was doing fine, he was ahead, and then the Willie Horton ad came out and he ignored it and he lost. So Democrats know that a colorblind approach doesn't work. They also know that leaning heavily into racial justice for communities of color tends to backfire with white voters. What they appreciate less, I think, is that it backfires with communities of color as well. But in any event, they have a sense that that doesn't work. And yet, because there's pressure on them from an energized racial justice movement to address racism, and as well there should be, right? They're like, great. So then they say, well, we'll do both. So and they'll say, well, I have two messages that don't work, and I'll go with two of them. And not surprisingly, it really ends up being contradictory and alienating different people. So think about Bernie Sanders would be, a great example. Really leaning heavily into a colorblind approach under tremendous pressure from Black Lives Matter and racial justice activists. So then he starts talking about racial justice. His white supporters who are all about economics are pissed off because they're like, you're just kowtowing to this sort of angry mob, but this isn't our issue. This is distracting from us. And then the racial justice folks are like, Bernie, we don't believe you. You're not sincere. Right? Like you lose, right? As opposed to if Bernie had said, and he did, he shifted late in the campaign, and I think he's more and more pushing in this direction. If Bernie had said, we want racial justice because it's the only route to economic populism. The rich have used racism to divide and distract working people. And if we want enough power to stand up to the rich and build a country in which there's a living wage and affordable health care and free college tuition, the only way we're going to do that is through a multiracial movement. And a multiracial movement has to be founded upon true racial equality. And that's why we're also going to deal with harms to communities of color, mass incarceration, systemic disinvestment. Racial justice is the route to economic populism for every racial group. If Bernie had said that, he would have explained to his white supporters why their issue depended upon building a cross-racial movement, and he would have convinced racial justice folks, oh, Bernie gets this. He's not doing this to pander to me. He's doing this because he sees that it's key to what he cares most about.
Thank you.
Well, yes, no, thank you so much. We only have a few minutes left. So I think I'll ask one question and then I'll wrap it up because we have some exciting additional events coming up. But you know, your research focuses on how people react to the messages, but we don't know whether it mobilizes them, for example, to vote. So, you know, you could say, I like this message, but it doesn't necessarily mobilize you. So how are you going to deal with that issue?
So once this got rolling in 17, 18, other groups picked it up, and one of the groups that picked it up is the sort of in Minnesota, sort of our Minnesota, and then they did a campaign, Greater Than Fear, and that's actually a great test because they put it into practice. This was progressive grassroots groups in Minnesota put it into practice. They were faith-based and also labor, SCIU. Their messaging built on this strategy was so successful, the Democratic Party in Minnesota eventually picked it up and used it and did really, really well in 2018 and and also in 2020 in a way that makes Minnesota, I mean, it's still highly competitive, but Minnesota and Wisconsin diverge at the point where Minnesota really starts using this approach. The other research that I would cite that I think is very well done and very impressive is research done by this group called People's Action, and People's Action is an umbrella group with the aim of mobilizing voters in rural America. And so rural America has large numbers of people of color, though it's still predominantly white. They wanted to test the efficacy of a race class approach. They used this message and they combined it with what's called canvassing. So on the door, speaking to people for 20 minutes. And they had some really terrific results showing, this is less the motivation, but this is more the durability. They tested whether they could convince people to support healthcare for all, including for undocumented immigrants. In other words, they picked the hardest issue they could. And they showed significant movement that was durable for 3 months. Right? So these are really, really big successes, again, for a message that people have never heard before. Because this message of cross-racial solidarity, we're being intentionally divided, we need to come together, it's got an immediate resonance. That's what this research is showing, but it hasn't been tried at scale, right? It hasn't become the stock frame by which Democrats or progressives talk about what's happening in our country. If we were to try it at scale, I would expect that the results would be, even more impressive, right? This really does seem like a promising new way to counteract the weaponization of racism in American politics.
Well, and on that very, I think, hopeful and promising note, we want to thank you, Professor López, for sharing this new research with us. It was tremendously interesting and engaging. I also want to thank everyone in the audience for participating today and asking such insightful questions. In closing, I just wanted to call to your attention to upcoming events. This Sunday, we'll be doing a film screening of a movie called Status Pending about the lives of immigration law attorneys. And we'll be very fortunate to be joined by the filmmaker as well as an attorney who appears in the film and two of the co-directors of our immigration law clinic here at UC Irvine. And then next Thursday on the 15th, we'll have another book talk by Professor Edward Theus on durable ethnicity. And he'll actually be exploring some of these questions of identity in the Latinx community that figured in today's talk. So I look forward to seeing you at future events and very much appreciate your participation in this one. Thank you.